I'm sorry to sort of seemingly pour a bit of cold water on the attitude of joy that has been here this morning. But you know what? A man named Lazarus was sick. I guess we can all relate to what it feels like to get that kind of news, can't we? You know, right now we can insert the name of someone we know. We get that message, and we know that it means that it's serious somehow. It's a very common experience. It's the beginning of our section for this morning. Well, one of the not so good things about getting older, I find, is that you get to go to more funerals. And yet, one of the good things about getting older is that you get to go to more funerals. Because, you know, I find they can be quite enriching experiences. And on one level, today's passage, our focus this morning, is a funeral. So I'm going to start with a joke, because I was told this joke at the last funeral I went to. It was back a few weeks ago when there was a massive petrol shortage. And it was a matte cartoon, this man told me, and there's a big notice which says, NHS workers only, allowed to get fuel. And crouching down behind the petrol pump are two characters, and one saying to the other, this is really brilliant. I'm going to get to see my doctor face to face. So funerals are emotional occasions. All kinds of complex emotions tend to come to the surface in funerals. I find that conversations happen at the wake afterwards that you think, they're quite amazing, really. People are a bit raw. And ironically, perhaps, I do find that laughter is one of them, that people start wanting to laugh. Anyway, let's get to our specific funeral, which is in a very different culture from ours and a completely different practice, of course. It's John chapter 11, and I'm going to read the whole account. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is sick. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But his disciples objected, Rabbi, only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again? Jesus replied, there are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of the world. But at night, there's danger of stumbling because they have no light. And then he said, our friend Lazarus is asleep, has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up. The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he'll soon get better. They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus was dead. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go and see him. Thomas, nicknamed the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too, die with him. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Mary and Martha in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, If only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. Yes, he will rise when everyone rises at the last day. Jesus told her, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? Do you believe this unbelievable thing, Martha? Yes, Lord. I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who's come into the world from God. And then she returned to Mary, and she called her aside from the mourners and said, the teacher's here and wants to see you. So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were in the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the other people wailing, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? Lord, come and see. And then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Roll the stone aside, Jesus said. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead 4 days. The smell will be terrible. Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. And then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, I thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so they will believe that you sent me. And then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came, hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. It's interesting to me that this first miracle, like the first, the changing of the water into wine, is in an intimate domestic setting. Jesus didn't go about doing miracles randomly all over the place. The bigger the crowd, the better, maximizing exposure. That was not his way at all. When Jesus acted, there was always some particular significance, some point, and it was always about raising and stimulating faith in those with a heart enough to go there. To those who could see, he was declaring his divinity. After changing water into wine, if you remember, the disciples saw his glory and they believed in him. There were loads of people at that wedding, many of whom didn't really know what was going on at all. But for the disciples, those who really saw and looked, opened their hearts, they saw his glory and they believed in him. But that was only the start. They had a long way to go. And here we are now at the grave of Lazarus, 3 years on. And the greatest test for the disciples and followers and friends of Jesus is just about to come. Their faith is going to be sorely tested. Your friend Lazarus is sick. To go or not to go? Why would Jesus not rush to these dear friends whom he loved? Well, it was a dangerous place for him, but his delay was not out of fear. He knew he was bound for Jerusalem soon anyway. But Jesus demonstrated absolutely a life that was lived in obedience to the Father and for the glory of God. And he acts in a way that will maximize the opportunity for his friends and followers to witness God's glory again and to believe more fully. I just imagine how the heart of Jesus is aching as he thinks about the ordeal that his little band are going to have to go through very soon. He wants to strengthen them as much as possible. And so Mary and Martha are going to have to suffer the sadness and death of their dear brother. And because of that, there's going to be this wonderful demonstration of God's power, and that will benefit them massively. It's going to be one of the last opportunities that Jesus has to show them and his disciples and anyone else who has a heart to be open to him. He's showing them who he is and giving them a taste of resurrection. They're going to need that if they're going to get their heads round what's going to happen in the coming weeks. Jesus loved them. The onlookers were right. See how he loved him. But they were only looking at a shallow surface of his love. Because he loved them, he didn't rush to stop Lazarus dying. He waited until his going would benefit them most. Now, when the disciples get to hear that Lazarus is dead, they are understandably extremely reluctant to go anywhere near Jerusalem. And there's just two little things in this little section of this account where Jesus is talking to his disciples when they're planning on going. I just think I want to draw our attention to and not really develop. The one idea is Jesus playing with this idea of sleep, both the word and the idea. He uses it for sleep and he uses it for death. You see, Jesus is God and he is thoroughly in touch with the eternal. He sees that great big cosmic eternal picture. And in speaking the way he does, he reveals from his eternal perspective the nature of death as sleep. And I think it would be really interesting if those of you are in life groups and use the notes that come from this to explore that in your life groups, death as sleep. And the second little thing which is interesting, I read this week, that there's Thomas. Dear Thomas, he was a twin. And he had this sort of twin-mindedness, faith and unbelief contending for mastery in Thomas. So he combines real devotion to Christ. Come on, let's go with him. It's scary, but let's go. With a tendency to see the dark side of things and die with him. That's what it's all going to end in. So off they go. And Jesus fully enters into the grief, the human grief of Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha are both still full of faith, but also bewilderment and questions and plain disappointment that Jesus didn't show up. If only you had been here. If only. Why didn't you come? You know, we relate to that, don't we? We've prayed and we seem to get no answer, certainly not the one that we want. And yes, we're still believing, we're hanging on by our fingertips, but we're shaken and we're wobbling. And Jesus looks at Martha and he feels for her deeply. He is the Word made human. As the Word, he is always seeking to change perspectives, to get people to see the bigger picture. And he invites Martha to exchange her if only with if Jesus. And he exclaims, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. I am everything the whole world longs for. The future has burst into the present, Martha. Resurrection is not just an idea, it's a person. And I'm here, Martha. I'm Messiah, I'm the Christ, God's Son. Martha's thinking has understandably been totally on the level which ours often is of, why isn't Jesus done something? But he is leading her into deeper faith and lifting her eyes to higher truths. It's so what we need when we come to God with our disappointments and with our questions, because he always meets us in the place where we are. And he meets us there with good news and with hope. And he lifts our eyes to him. And I just want, as an aside, and again, this might be something interesting to pursue in life groups, is the difference between Mary and Martha's questions, which are deep questions, but which come from a position of faith, and the questions of some of the accompanying mourners who've come from Jerusalem, where they were there when that blind man was healed, like Joel spoke about last week. They mention it. And it's almost like, apparently, he healed a blind man. Surely he could have done something about Lazarus. You can get that. There's a difference in attitude. And they're not going to be rewarded because they're not coming from that place of faith. So amazingly, even as Jesus is declaring himself the resurrection and the life, he weeps because he is also the Word made flesh. And his dear friends are distraught. He weeps with them. But even in that weeping, he is showing us who God is. God cries with the world's crying. In Isaiah 53, we read, it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And Jesus, as God and man, is deeply troubled, angry even. He is taking on in that place so much more than Mary and Martha, really. He is looking death in the face with full knowledge of the whole hopeless human condition of death and separation and loneliness. And his own terrible death is imminent. We can't really imagine the grief in his heart. It is only going to be through his own death that death will be defeated and the world will be redeemed. There's a straight line from Jesus' tears to the cross, to his sharing in the doom of the world. And God isn't just love as an action. He is love in his very being. Jesus, what this account is telling us is that Jesus was God incarnate among us, very God and very man. God's covenant love embraces all humanity with mercy. It's a redemptive love. But at this point in history, Jesus, as God-man, is facing suffering and death in order that that redemptive love will be realized. The tomb of Lazarus is a meeting place for Jesus for all these elements. But his standing there is not a one-off, not like God in human form in getting to see for once what it's like for us humans. It's a window on what God is always like in his absolute loveness, which flows out from himself to all mankind in our lostness and sadness, which he always sees. Well, I'm going to finish with a question, which is a question for us this morning here and for all mankind, for the whole human race. It hangs over us. We can't ignore it. And it's the question that Pilate is to ask the crowd a few weeks later. It is, what shall I do with Jesus? Which implies, who is he? Who do you think he is? Well, Mary, Martha, and the disciples had answered that question with faith. That he's the Son of God, the Messiah, come to save the world. They still have their uncertainties. There are gaps in their understanding, questions, but they're ready to bow down. As I've mentioned, there were others among the mourners that day whose hearts were hardened in their rejection of who Jesus was claiming to be. And there would have been some in between, of course. Not sure. Still thinking about it. And I always like to think that sometimes some of these people were perhaps finally convinced by Peter's first sermon at Pentecost or during those early, exciting, heady days when all the apostles were preaching in Jerusalem after Jesus' ascension. But it's the same today. The chap who cut my hair this week asked me what I'd been doing that morning. I don't know if he regretted the question, because I said I'd been preparing a sermon, and I asked him, who do you think Jesus is? And an interesting conversation ensued. In fact, he turned the question back on me and said, well, what do you think? Are you saying he's the Son of God? Why do you say that? He kept on having to turn off the hairdryer because we were talking. The question hangs there, doesn't it? It hangs there for every human being. Let us here this morning, and you people online, let us fall at his feet like Mary and declare him to be the Son of God. Amen.